Hi, my name is Lisa Cummings, and today I'm going to talk with you about cash balance plans and how, as an organization, you can think about managing the funding risk of the cash balance plan. A little about our law firm. Our law firm is Cummings and Cummings Law. You can find us online at cummings.law. That's www.cummings.law. Cummings and Cummings Law is a full-service law firm. We assist businesses as well as individuals with a full array of their legal needs. A little bit about myself. I have focused my career in supporting large organizations in ensuring that they are establishing retirement benefit programs that are both compliant as well as cost effective for their employees. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about cash balance funding for the cash balance plan and help you remember that the promised interest credit is stable from the participant's viewpoint. However, the funding that the employer must make on the benefit of those underlying participants every single year is not necessarily stable. Cash balance plans can generate large deductible contributions, but they also create a responsibility for the organization, and that is funding the promised benefit. The participant statement will look very smooth and predictable because it is based upon a formula. However, the underlying investments for that particular cash balance plan and the funding rules, which have to be followed as required by the IRS, can move around. Today, we're discussing various funding risks that you will need to manage proactively: underfunding, overfunding, and market fluctuations. Whenever you think about the cash balance plan funding, then the key element is to remember the promised interest credits that is defined upfront in the cash balance plan legal document when the plan is first established. That promised interest credit may be stated things like a flat 5% of earnings on an annual basis as the pay credit, and then the interest credit may be guaranteeing a stated rate equal to maybe treasury bill or a particular tied to some form of an index. The interest credit is part of the plan's promise. And in that, the plan's trust investments earn actual market returns, which may be higher or lower than the credited rate. However, when the actual market return diverges from the promised commitment, then that can be a concern for the organization. A mismatch between the promised interest credit and the actual return can result in funding risk over time. Cash balance plan funding, whether it's underfunded or overfunded, can have an adverse impact on the organization. How it happens and how you should respond obviously vary differently depending upon whether it's underfunding or overfunding. Underfunding happens when the plan assets are not keeping pace with the plan's liabilities, meaning the value of the promised benefits has grown faster than the investment of the underlying assets in the trust. Overfunding, most people think, well, if we're overfunded, that's great. However, that too can create some constraints. So let's first look at underfunding. Underfunding means when the assets, that is the cumulative employer contributions, which have been made over years, and the investments thereon, which sits inside its separate little trust, when those assets are below the actual required liabilities that has been determined by the actuary, and those liabilities are based upon the promise that is made to every single one of those plan participants. A minimum required contribution can result as this underfunding occurs over a period of time. Some common drivers of an underfunding situation would be where the returns are less than the interest crediting assumptions, crediting rates rise, or where the employee census shifts and the employees become older. Additionally, another driver for underfunding is if the contributions are made late or inconsistently. I never advise any of my clients to be late in their contribution funding. It is imperative to remain in compliance with IRS regulations that the organization can show that in good faith they are funding on a timely basis. What you may see is higher funding target in the valuation. That means the organization that year, right then, needs to be able to step up and place more contributions in the cash balance plan trust than it has in prior years. And also, there will be less timing flexibility with tighter minimums. Some practical actions will be to fund earlier to smooth this funding fluctuation, as well as the idea of aligning investments with liabilities. In this, it would be important to also review future accruals. That's going to be coming from your actuary and design proactively. Remember, cash balance plans are defined benefit plans. Funding will result and depend on assets compared to the liabilities. Now let's contrast what we've just talked about with the underfunding to the overfunding scenario. If a particular plan becomes overfunded, what that means is the assets exceed the measured liabilities. And this will create some cushion for future years so that the organization may not have to contribute as much to the cash balance trust in future years. Some common drivers will be where your returns are greater than the assumptions, strong funding in prior years, or workforce changes reduce liabilities. So perhaps the employee overall age has decreased. What you might see, lower near-term contribution need within limits, and a potential surplus that reduces flexibility. Practical actions to take: use the cushion to stabilize contributions, avoid over-depositing year over year, and plan ahead for long-term goals and timing. Market fluctuations. This is the real culprit behind the mismatch of the liabilities to the assets. Market volatility is the engine behind both underfunding and overfunding. The key is that the cash balance plans have a unique dynamic. The plan is crediting an interest rate participant accounts even if the market is down. Imagine that the plan credits 5% interest, but the investments return a negative 8% in a year. On paper, the participant balances will increase because it's all based upon this predetermined formula. However, the trust assets have actually declined. That gap can show up as required contribution increase from the organization. This is why liability-aware investing matters. Many plan sponsors reduce volatility by focusing on strategies that are designed to track the nature of the liabilities, often with a higher allocation to high quality, fixed income, and controlled level of growth assets. The goal in investing the trust assets of a cash balance plan is not, repeat, not to beat the market. The goal here is to reduce the mismatch between the assets and the liability. And that means what the plan promises as well as what the plan earns. So the key term here being asset liability matching. When you're thinking about funding for a cash balance plan, some things to think about include an annual checklist. So annually, the organization, alongside its ERISA counsel, its investment management, actuary, will set a written funding policy. and how the underlying assets of the trust, of the cash balance, should be invested. And then the organization may choose to contribute monthly or quarterly to smooth some of the market volatility. Keep in mind, they are required to contribute at least annually. And then align in the investments with the interest crediting rate, or to match your investments with the liability. Monitor any sort of census triggers. That's employee census. That's when you may have a departure or an addition of a large number of employees, compensation changes, as well as partner additions. And then review the plan design annually by having your actuary model different stress tests, such as have the actuary model, well, what if the markets are down and they're down by X% over Y years? Or what if interest rates move? And what if they were to rise or fall sharply? And then also model potential employee census changes. What if we add another older partner? Or what if the headcount, the employee staff headcount, or compensation changes overall? The goal behind this annual funding review is to reduce the mismatch between the promised interest credits and the actual returns of the cash balance trust. As some practical next steps, the best way to manage your funding risk is to treat a cash balance plan like what it is, a defined benefit promise with a cash balance style statement. You can reduce underfunding surprises, avoid overfunding traps, and navigate market fluctuations confidently if you have in place a clear funding policy, aligned investments, and annual stress testing. Start your cash balance plan off at the beginning by ensuring you select the right ERISA counsel that can assist you in coordinating all of these important activities for your cash balance plan. If I may provide you with any additional information, feel free to send me an email, lisa@cummings.law. Thank you so much for joining us today.